China's political season, known as Two Sessions, comes to a close. We'll discuss Beijing's top priorities for the coming year. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Chinese lawmakers joined Chinese President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on Friday. The legislature, known as the National People's Congress, closed its session after deputies approved budgets and key measures for the year. As tradition, Premier Li Keqiang held a press conference with reporters where he discussed a range of topics, including the Ukraine conflict, China-U.S. relations, and China's economy. Beijing has set this year's economic growth at 5.5%, a target Premier Li acknowledged will be a challenge.
This year we face new and downside risks and challenges. There's a lot of complexities and rising uncertainty. On the basis of over 100 trillion yuan of GDP in China today, a 5.5% increase would generate the same amount of output equivalent to the size of a medium economy. We aim to achieve this 5.5% GDP growth target for China's economy this year. This kind of steady progress is very important in itself, and it needs to be enabled by the support of a series of macroeconomic policies.
China was the only major economy to grow in 2020 during the coronavirus pandemic, but consumer spending has yet to fully recover. For more on this year's Two Sessions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. From Philadelphia, Neysun Mahboubi is a research scholar with the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. From Israel, Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, and Tangen is a political and economic affairs commentator. He is based in Beijing. Thank you, everyone. Tangen, as we heard, economic stability is the priority for China's leaders. They have set a goal of 5.5% GDP growth for this year. Is that achievable?
Well, I think so. I mean, for most economies, given the kind of headwinds we have internationally and domestically, rising inflation, a lot of unknowns, it would be very difficult. China has a a very large toolbox when they can deal with these types of issues. They are already moving on both in terms of fiscal and monetary policy to loosen up the economy remarkably, as other economies around the world are kind of tightening in, getting prepared for what could be very rough waters ahead. China is actually trying to grow its economy. So a little bit of a different stream as we go forward.
Liang, the government's target there that I was talking about, 5.5%, that's the lowest it's been in 3 decades, but it is higher than the IMF's projection, which is 4.8%. So how would you assess the strength of the Chinese economy?
Well, thank you for having me, Anand. So I think, yes, as Premier Li Keqiang talked about, this 5.5% growth rate is still a pretty ambitious one, according to some of the economists. And I think Premier Li himself has talked about, the difficulties, the challenges. One being that China is already so big, and to continue to grow is going to be difficult. And also the international pressure, and also China's own structural challenges like population aging, and also some of the more contemporary problems like the slowdown of the real estate investment. So I think all these are the challenges, and that's why the projected growth rate is set at 5.5 instead of higher. Let's remember last year the GDP growth rate was 8.1%. But despite all these challenges, I think what the Chinese government clearly realizes, as Tangen talked about, is that there are policy toolkits, and they are actively using these toolkits to help to promote economic growth. One major one, I think, is the fiscal spending. So the government has talked about the fiscal deficit spending of about 3.37 trillion yuan in the coming year, which is about 2.8% of the GDP. And they have been talked about the special bonds issuance for the local governments at, again, 3.65 trillion yuan. and the Ministry of Finance has already issued about 40% of the quota. On top of that, there is 1.2 trillion unused funds from the bonds from last year. So there are a lot of fiscal stimulus and also tax cuts and rebates. That's about 2.5 trillion yuan. So there are a lot of fiscal policies in place to support the economy, especially the medium and small and medium-sized companies. And the monetary policy will remain prudent, but would ease the credits towards these small and medium-sized enterprises as well.
So, Liang, the basis of China's economy has been changing. It's already started those changes. It's moving away from just being a manufacturing economy. So in this coming year, with the kind of growth that we're talking about, where do you see the potential for big growth?
Yeah, I think from the government's perspective, it's very important for China to engage in technological innovation, boosting labor productivity. If you look at their job creation targets, it's about 11 million jobs, and that's just about enough to absorb the new college graduates, which is expected to surpass 10 million this year. So if we're not creating a lot more jobs, let's remember last year's job creation is about 12.6 million. So if we're not growing too many more jobs, then I think that GDP growth rate would come from productivity growth. And that, I think, has some good impact on, for example, boosting labor income and consumption. The labor productivity grew at about 8.7% last year. So I think the government's really trying to boost technological innovations and to increase that productivity. And how do they go about doing that? I think for one is they're really trying to use tax incentives to boost R&D spendings for, especially from the small and medium-sized companies. And they also have set up many of these government-guided investment funds to really help to finance the research and development, basic, sort of research and innovations.
John Gong, Liang, they were talking about the job market in China, and there are concerns about that job market. The country has something like 16 million urban job seekers coming onto that market, and that includes about just actually more than 10 million college graduates. How do you see it? Where does the government create jobs?
Well, I think fundamentally job growth is tied to the economy. I think there's still a lot of uncertainty associated with the economy. People, let me first correct that it's actually not 5.5%. It's about 5.5%. That leaves some room in case the growth is not going to be 5.5. I think even above 5%, between 5 to 5.5%, it is already a great achievement. China's economy is fundamentally becoming more like a developed country. And we know there's this convergence theory that for most developed countries, the GDP growth is something like 3 or 4%. I would say 3% is regarded as high growth. And China's economy is more and more becoming like this. You also have to keep in mind the way Chinese politics works. Really in history has the government has failed its growth target. In other words, when they put some number on the table, they should be pretty confident that this is very achievable. Only like external events like of great proportions, like the pandemic, for example, has derailed Chinese government's economic growth target. So with that in mind, I think let's ask this question: what are the unknowns at this point? I think there's still this pandemic is still very much an unknown. The first quarter, as we know it, is going to be pretty poor. There are outbreaks in many places in China, so we would expect the first quarter number isn't going to be good. Second, I think the external uncertainty is with respect to this war. We haven't really captured the overall impact on China as a result of what's going on in Ukraine. And I think the Premier Li's government work report is already written by the time this war broke out. So, there's very much little to talk about. Even the press conference, I think, is very much little to talk about the impact of this war on China. So I think these two things would be, the major issues that still very much going to hang in the sky, that's going to have an impact on China's economy for the rest of the year. We just have to see what's the impact on the Chinese economy, what's the impact on China's exports. I'm very concerned about the trade between European European Union and China, whether it's going to be significantly impacted from China's perspective.
John, not so long ago, economists were telling us that China needed a minimum growth rate of 6% to meet the demands on the job market. And we are talking now of 5.5%. So are you confident that the government will be able to meet the demands made by the job market in the coming year?
Yeah, well, I think 11 million new jobs created. This is actually, I think, was a sort of a middle of the ground number. If you look at the past few years, I think it's above 10 million new jobs created. I haven't mentioned there's actually another underlying economic force at work at this point. That is, China's economy is becoming more and more digitized. In other words, the more jobs created in the digital sectors of the economy, and I would expect that with the wider adoption of robotics and machine learning and these new technologies, there will be job slashes in these as a result of the new technologies. So we're really in a sort of a transformational stage at this point. But I think overall, 11 million is actually not such an ambitious target in my view. If the economy recovers, if it's on target for 5.5% growth, I think 11 million is probably quite achievable. I pay more hope on the export sector. I mean, if you look at the performance last year, what's really picking up is the export sector. And I would expect that the export sector should be able to perform even stronger this year. With Chinese companies becoming more competitive, with a lot of companies in the West are going to be affected by the war. So I think that there might be some room for growth, hopefully, in other parts of the world. So overall, I think even if 11 million is not achieved, it's going to be short by only a very little number. Right. I don't think it's going to be a huge number. So I think we're okay.
Neysun Mahboubi, let's talk about the relationship between China and the United States. Premier Li, at that news conference, called for cooperation between China and the United States. And we, of course, know that these two countries have been in a trade war since 2018. This is what Premier Li said. Let's listen.
China and the U.S. are both permanent members of the UN Security Council and are respectively the largest developing and developed country in the world. Handling their bilateral relations well is concerned with the well-being of the two peoples. We still hope that the two countries will respect each other, coexist peacefully, pursue win-win cooperation, properly manage differences in a rational and constructive manner, and respect each other's core interests and major concerns, following the consensus reached between the two heads of states in their virtual meeting at the end of last year. There should be more dialogue and communication.
So, Neysun, how do you see this relationship evolve?
I think that there is a certain kind of analysis that has some currency both in China and in the United States, that the relationship remains as turbulent as it was during the Trump administration, that the Biden administration has continued many of the policies from the Trump administration that caused friction, and that the Chinese side has not modulated its approach. I actually am not entirely on board that analysis. I think there's lots of things that we've been able to see over the course of the past year and a half that are more promising, that some of the things, for example, the tariffs have not changed, the rhetoric on some issues has not changed, for sure. But I think there are these little sprouts of more positive developments that we've been noticing. And one type of thing that we could even just mention from the other day is that the USTR has decided not to pursue its new Section 301 investigation for now. I think all of that, however, is now secondary to the fallout from this Ukraine war. And whether or not those types of things that I was viewing as potentially positive, whether or not they have runway to develop further really depends on whether the U.S. and China can get on the same page vis-a-vis Russia's aggressive action in Ukraine. If they can, then I think there is still a lot of possibility for better dynamics going forward. If they can't, I think it's going to be a big, big problem going forward.
Liang, as Neysun says, there is some reason to be optimistic in the relationship between the two countries. What's your view on that?
Yes, I think indeed. If you look at the recent developments, for example, the Justice Department dropped the China Initiative and the dropping of the Section 301 investigation. But then there's also the very recent move that threatened delisting 5 of the Chinese companies from the United States capital market and then spooked investors and caused the tech stocks to tumble. So I think what it really shows is that the Biden administration has still yet to come up with a real comprehensive and consistent, sort of China strategy. Or maybe what they say is they will confront at some places and collaborate at others. Maybe is that their strategy? But I agree with Nathan that things could change quickly depending on the Russia-Ukraine situation. But that said, I really think that the Biden administration needs to really think about the trade strategies, not only with China, but also around the globe. Partly, the U.S. is now under such a big, inflationary pressure, and I think dropping all the tariffs or at least moderate them, phase them out, would really help the United States. And let's not forget that Biden is facing the midterm election, and I think the inflation is definitely a big concern. So I think there's a lot of reasons for the administration to go towards a more positive direction with China, and yet I totally understand the political backlash against that.
Aina Tang and a number of our panelists have talked about Ukraine. Let me get your view on that. China, of course, has a policy, a long-standing policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Premier Li, at that news conference, he did address the situation in Ukraine right now. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The current situation in Ukraine is indeed disconcerting. We should do our best to support Russia and Ukraine to overcome difficulties, conduct ceasefire negotiations, and reach a peaceful outcome. We support and encourage all efforts to resolve the crisis peacefully. The top priority is to prevent tensions from escalating or even getting out of control. There is consensus in the international community and all parties for this.
So, Anna, China is probably among very few countries, perhaps the only one that enjoys the confidence of both sides in this conflict. Is there an opening here for China to broker a peace deal of some kind?
Well, it all depends on the United States. I mean, if the U.S. sees China's efforts as somehow, pro-Russian, it's just going to invite more abuse. However, over the last couple of days, you've seen a number of phone calls between high-level Chinese and high-level Europeans, and I think there's a real opening there. Now, what's interesting is you have the political rhetoric, which is very high at this point, but the economic realities are very severe, and this is particularly true between the U.S. and Europe. Europe doesn't have anywhere to go for its energy. If they don't get the Russian gas, there's no gas that they can get. They can bid up the existing gas supplies that are supplied by LNG, but they're not. It's going to be taking a zero-sum game at this point. It'll take at least 3 to 4 years to increase LNG capacity, even near where Europe needs it. So China has this opportunity, but this question at what cost? Will it put them closer to Europe if they're actually able to broker something between it? But right now, the situation in Russia is that it appears that Putin is going to see what kind of ground game he has before he comes to the table. It's unfortunate, but that seems the reality.
But China also has a relationship with Ukraine. It does have the ear of Ukrainian leaders, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, China is Ukraine's largest trading partner in 2019. It's absolutely strategic to the Belt and Road Initiative. It's one of those things where literally China has been banking on Ukraine for a long period of time, especially as vis-a-vis going to Europe and things like, and other markets in the Middle East, et cetera. So they're not really willing to give it up. The difficulty is that China sees both sides. They've seen the quotes from Biden and the current and Burns, who's the current CIA director back in 2007, where they said, if we keep expanding in NATO, it's going to mean war. And they look at that and they kind of scratch their head and say, you knew this was coming. Why did you let it get out of control? On the other hand, it's very difficult for China to endorse any kind of activity where one country is sending troops into another country. it is absolutely sacrosanct. This idea that the internal affairs of countries have to be settled by those countries, not by outside forces. So they're trying to be very rational about this and say both sides have to kind of come together. They understand Russia's desire for security guarantees, especially in the face of an expanding NATO and a realization by those who are doing it that this was going to lead to a conflict. But on the other hand, there's a lot of feeling for the suffering of the Ukrainian people. China has sent a Red Cross mission donations to the Ukrainian situation. But right now, it's just a no-win situation. Hopefully, China can get involved. But as I said, this could be another impediment to U.S.-China relations.
Neysun Mahboubi, on Friday, President Biden also announced that he would end Russia's most favored nation trade status, and he banned the import of all Russian vodka, seafood, and diamonds. And as expected, the EU and the G7 nations will follow the US announcement. There are also efforts underway now, we know, to suspend Russia from the WTO. What is the potential fallout for the global economy with these measures?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that the EU has followed in the US's lead on these issues, because I do want to suggest, contrary somewhat to my colleague Einar Tangen's earlier point, that reaching out to the EU as somehow a wedge against the US is not really an option for China right now. I think that was a strategy that they were developing and had some runway before this particular crisis, for sure. But I think that it's very important for Chinese official actors to understand that the US and EU are very closely aligned on this particular issue, and trying to kind of separate out the US and EU is not going to be a productive strategy. So I think in terms of the global economy, right now, Russia is turning into a global pariah state. And I think the question is, does China want to be on the side of the US and EU in maintaining global stability outside of this one global pariah state, or does China want to be on the side of the global pariah state? And if it wants to be on that side, obviously, given that China is the second largest economy in the world, it's going to create turbulence in the global economy, which is not going to be good for anybody, including China. So it's really, I think China has a big choice that is before them, and they're not going to be able to get out of it in the way that they may have liked to, given their own priorities from before.
Neysun, why would Chinese involvement be seen as a wedge between the United States and Europe, or as an attempt to create a wedge between the United States and Europe? Surely all sides want to see this resolved.
Well, what I meant by that is just to say that in the tensions with the U.S. That pre-existed this crisis, I think China was making some headway in creating common cause with European countries on economic issues that was sort of an end run around some of the issues they were facing with the U.S. My only point here is just to say that on this particular issue, the Ukraine crisis, the U.S. and the EU are on the same page entirely. There's too much resonance with European history from World War II and World War I with what Russia has done in Ukraine for Europe to view this any way differently than the U.S. does. And so I do think for global stability, for global economic growth, for all of those things, it would be better for China to be on the same page as the U.S. and the EU sooner than later.
Einar Tangen, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I completely disagree. I mean, if you listen to what I said, the political rhetoric and the emotional side is at odds with the economic realities. Europe does not have another place to go for many of the things, especially when it comes to energy. Food is going to be impacted. So yes, right now there's a tremendous amount of hostility towards Russia, but this idea that you have to be on the right side of history simply by saying that, acknowledging that Russia's incursion into Ukraine is bad, yes, but how about everything before? He did not answer this issue that in 2007, you have two of the people, the president and the head of the CIA, saying, yes, if we go into Ukraine, it's going to cause a war. I mean, the expansion of NATO, they put that out there directly. And, this idea that you can, walk into a situation and say, oh, I see a dead body, I see somebody with a gun, all right, I'm going to assume they murdered them, when in fact what happened was the other way around. It was they were acting in self-defense, or at least that is their perspective. So this jumping on Russia as a way of kind of solving this, that is a no-end situation. All right, if you say you can get rid of Russia completely and Belarus and anybody who's associated with them, that might smack of a lot of emotional, you might feel good about it now, but the realities aren't going to work out. What are you going to do about, places like in the Middle East, who 60% of their wheat is dependent on Russia and Ukraine? I mean, it's almost juvenile in the sense that you can just have these actions and there aren't global repercussions. We've already seen that with the global supply chain. I mean, this idea that you can tug on one part of the twine ball and everything will just work out has not worked out. So I think this kind of idea that you have to be on the right side of history is exactly the wrong side of history.
John, Gong, about the food security chain, supply chain. Food security, of course, is a key priority for President Xi Jinping. And as we've just heard, there are now concerns, there are big question marks over the supply of food from Russia, from Ukraine. Was that addressed during the two sessions?
Well, first let me say that let's first set aside a question about standing on the right side of history. I think the most important thing right now is to stand on the side of peace. I think I think China's position is that let's try to find a ceasefire condition. Let's try to seek a political solution to this. I think that's what China's coming from. In terms of whether China sides with the so-called the world's prior state or the rest of the world, the thing is that what do we mean by standing on the side of the alliance side, I guess? I mean, there are more countries, there are many more countries that are actually not imposing sanctions, and sanctions has historically performed quite poorly in terms of achieving its political goals, other than hurting the Russian people potentially, as it has the sanctions against Cuba, for example, it's hurt Cuban people. And it's being and it's going to take a long time to take a toll on those ruling the state, if at all. So I'm not sure that that kind of a characterization can be done in that simplistic way. It's a complicated situation calling for a complicated solution. Now back to your question, Arnold, about the supply chain. Yes, absolutely. I think there's a great concern about supply chain, particularly with respect to the food security. I think I think Anna mentioned the Middle East, and I think for China as well. China is a big importer of agricultural products from Ukraine and Russia, and now it's becoming a big problem.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Have a great weekend.